Yeah, so hi everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this artist talk by Chris Alton as part of our Common Art Garden exhibition at Catalyst Art. Um, Chris's work after the revolution, they built an art school over the golf course as part of the exhibition, along with works by Jerome Bell, Aidan Wall, Emmett Brown, and a zine library curated by Bloomberg. And we haven't been able to open the exhibition just yet to the public due to lockdown restrictions, but we're hoping to do so really soon, next Friday. But in the meantime, it's really nice to be able to kind of kick off the conversations with this program of online events, starting tonight with Chris. And then next week we have events with Dirty Books, Just Books, Bloomers, and also Fiona Woods. So do check out the website if anyone is interested. All the details are there. Chris is going to talk us through his work in the exhibition, his practice and its relationship to the commons, as well as his interest in skateboarding, Quakerism, and lots more. So really looking forward to hearing that. And we've been told that his cat might even make an appearance. So Chris, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, wicked. Yeah, no guarantees on the cat. Totally unscheduled arrival. Cool. So yeah, my name is Chris Alton. I'm an artist and I live in Manchester at the moment. Moved here about a year ago. Previously, I was living in Croydon in South London, which is also where I was born, but I actually grew up in North Devon in a really rural area. The nearest city was about an hour and a half away. You had to get a bus and then a rickety train with 2 carriages and no heating. So yeah, about an hour and a half away to the nearest city. I lived in a village called Braunton. We were really close to the sea. And because it's on the north coast of Devon, the surf is pretty good, and the water gets slightly above freezing, so you can go in it. So there was a lot of surf culture, and I got kind of into surfing. I enjoyed it, but for me, the board sport that I was like most drawn to was skateboarding. So I started skating when I was maybe 13 or 14, because my younger brother started going to an after-school club at a local indoor skate park and just learning the basics, and I ended up getting into it through him. And I think skating was my first sort of creative outlet, not only the act of skating, which is, I think, very creative. Every trick that you do, every kind of interaction with an obstacle is an act of creation, but also through photography and making videos. So when I say photography and making videos, do not picture me with some kind of like massive DSLR or proper video camera. I had this tiny little like compact digital camera that my mum owned, and picture that compact camera, and I'll double it in size. It's a big silver brick, and I would borrow this camera and I would film my friends. And I think over the course of maybe 2 or 3 years, I made somewhere in the region of 60 to 80 YouTube videos of me and my friends out skating in skate parks, but also in the streets. We would anywhere that looked good for skating, that had stairs or ledges or slopes, any kind of plaza areas. Weirdly, you kind of end up with these plazas often outside of cultural spaces. So obviously there's the South Bank in London, outside of Macba in Barcelona is really popular. So is outside of the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. So I've been to a couple of these places to skate, and it's always been a really important part of my life. And it definitely taught me a lot about how to interact with the world, and that one's interactions with the world weren't actually as limited as one might initially think. You know, a bench isn't just for sitting down. You can do a whole bunch of tricks on it or whatever with the right apparatus or the right mindset. The other kind of big influence on me in my life growing up is Quakerism. So the Quakers are a breakaway group. They broke away from Christianity around the time of the English Civil War. So that's the mid-1600s. And the Quakers, as well as a bunch of other groups like the Levellers and the Diggers, were saying things that were pretty contrary to how power was arranged at the time. So Quakers, for instance, believed that everyone was equal in the eyes of God and was equally close to God, which kind of spat in the face of the king being God's representative on earth. And, you know, people were killed for saying this kind of stuff, although a lot of Quakers did survive because they were largely based in the north of England, which is slightly less inaccessible if you've got to march your army the whole way up there. So for me, Quakerism, the things that I really gravitated towards in it were the more activist strands of it. I'm not going to kind of get into the theology of it because it's really varied. But it's the activist strands. It is how Quakers put their faith into action to oppose the arms trade, to campaign for nuclear disarmament, to get really involved in direct action and other forms of campaigning on all kinds of issues to do with peace and justice, anti-racism, anti-fascism, LGBTQI rights. And I was around people who were directly involved in these kinds of campaigns and this kind of work from a really young age. So someone that I always think of is a woman called Helen Stephen. So Helen was a very prominent peace activist. I first heard her talk when I was about 13, and she spoke about how, her Quaker faith led her to be involved, particularly in anti-nuclear activism. And she told this great story. It was so vivid, about breaking into Faslane. So Faslane is a military base in Scotland where they have the Vanguard class submarines which house the UK's Trident nuclear weapons. So Helen, in her I think she was in her 60s at the time, broke into this nuclear weapons base, boarded a submarine, poured soil and planted potatoes all over the computers, and then tried to do a runner in a canoe. And she was obviously picked up by, I'm assuming, like the military police or whatever, and went to prison for that. But it was, I suppose, hearing from people who were, doing these quite, in a way, poetic as well as very political things that really had a big influence on me growing up. So I'm going to start with a project called English Disco Lovers. So I started in 2012. I was a student and going into my second year at university on a fine art course. And during the summer, I'd seen a couple of exhibitions that had really shaken up what I thought art could be, or what art could do in particular, I think. So they were Jeremy Deller and his show Joy in People at the Hayward Gallery, which had kind of demonstrated to me how art could be actually really embedded in the real world or the world outside the gallery, and how it could draw on all kinds of sources, particularly sources from popular culture and music. And the other show that I saw was Yale Botana and Europe Will Be Stunned. which is a trilogy of films, as well as kind of surrounding ephemera like manifestos and posters and stuff. But the trilogy is about a fictional political group called the Jewish Renaissance Movement in Poland. And the group is headed up by a Polish intellectual, he's a real guy, left-wing guy called Sławomir Syriakowski. And he kind of plays the sort of lead role in this political movement, which invites the Jewish people to return to Poland. It's a very complex series of films that are sort of unpicking the tropes of Nazi propaganda, particularly with regard to Nazi propaganda in cinema. And I'd highly recommend seeking those out if you can. They were produced by Art Angel. So those were two big things that really shifted how I thought about art and what art could do. And the result in many ways was English Disco Lovers. But what is English Disco Lovers? So English Disco Lovers shares the acronym of a far-right, fascist, racist group called the English Defence League. And I had the idea of taking disco music, a typically loving, welcoming, but also quite secretly, or not secretly, but it's got an underlying political current to it. And I decided I wanted to take that music and redeploy it in opposition to the English Defence League. And this logo was kind of the starting point, taking the heraldry of the English Defence League, because they sort of, they form their identity as a group around heraldry, around knights, around crusaders. So I wanted to take that heraldry and subvert it. So I obviously put in a disco ball shield and a dancer, and put in this Latin slogan, Unus Mundus Una Gens Unus Disco. This isn't Latin, this is a bad Google Translate of Latin. You can't translate the word disco from Latin into English or the other way around. It hasn't got an equivalent. But by like a really happy accident, if you do try and take disco from Latin into English, you get a word to the effect of I learn to know, or I become acquainted with. So there's actually this sense of broadening, a sense of rotation, much like a disc does, but it becomes about learning more, becoming acquainted with more people, more ideas. And there was something, really appealing about that accident. There are lots of kind of different things that underpin English Disco Lovers as an idea. So when I do a project, I will go digging. I will try and sort of piece together a little bit of a puzzle that makes a bit of sense of what I'm doing and how that relates to historical events. So what you've kind of got here is a bit of a mood board, I suppose. If we start in the bottom left corner, you've got Nazi-occupied Paris in the 1940s. So jazz music was banned under the Nazis. It was degenerate music. So the Nazis deemed music and art to be degenerate if it was largely made by Black people or Jewish people or people who were kind of, not part of their sort of Aryan plan. So when jazz is banned, people start to open up these secret cafes where you can go and listen to jazz instead. And they can't have live musicians because that's way too risky. So they start relying on records, and that is where the word comes from. Discotheque is a record library. It is a secret French cafe where people go and listen to jazz records whilst their city is occupied by the Third Reich. And there's a chap there who's labelled Les Jajus. So they were this kind of Parisian equivalent of punks or teddy boys, and they used music and fashion as a way of defying Nazism. and they only kind of really exist through these like newspaper cartoons. There aren't really many photos of them or anything, but the men and the women would wear these big oversized checkered coats, fold up their trousers, slick their hair back, dye it. The guys had like tiny little mustaches, and they all carried umbrellas, even if it was like really good weather. So the other stuff that I was thinking about was, you know, more straightforward. It was disco, a music produced by and for people of colour, the queer community. So I've got stuff like Paradise Garage up there, Sylvester, a record sleeve from a Heaven 17 track. But what I'm going to draw your attention to now is the top left corner, which is this campaign called Disco Sucks, which was kind of, I guess, fronted or put together by a guy called Steve Dahl. So Steve Dahl was a Chicago radio DJ, and I suppose, you know, there was a sort of underlying anti-disco sentiment in the States at the time, which he very much capitalized on. So Dahl very much scapegoated disco for its associations with Black and queer people. And he brought together this huge rally in 1979 called Disco Demolition Night, where he invited people to bring on disco records. And at halftime, he came out in army fatigues, did a lap of honor around the pitch in a Jeep, and then blew up this crate of disco records. And people were like frisbeeing records into the middle of the stadium. They rushed the field. They started like lighting bonfires. And it's kind of been called the day that disco died. And to be fair, like disco was kind of already morphing into something else. It was in the way that club culture does. It was evolving and changing, turning into house and many other things. But it is, yeah, totally undeniable that Disco Sucks had an effect, and that Disco Sucks was racist and homophobic, vehemently so. And it has these kind of echoes of Nazism in that they were burning disco records as opposed to burning books. I'm just going to pause to ask, can you hear a car alarm going off? Because there's a car alarm going off on my street that I can hear. Are we all good? No one can hear it? I'm seeing thumbs up and nods, so I'm just going to crack on. Cool. So what all that research ends up informing is this group. So I start a Facebook group and a Twitter page, and I make a website, and I basically say, with kind of no idea really how to bring it into being, that I want to become the top EDL on Google, and I want to get more likes than the English Defence League. I want to get more Twitter followers. And I just sort of get to work. I'm making these sort of silly memes about the English Defence League and English disco lovers, and sort of, you know, they're all kind of to the effect of being a fascist sucks. Why don't you just come to our disco where everyone is, you know, right on and loves each other and isn't into discriminating because of sexuality or race. So they're quite like flippant memes, but this project grows and grows and grows, and within a few months it's getting press attention from The Guardian and Der Spiegel. I'm working with people to organise nights and to organise counter-English Defence League protests, and within about 12 months the English Disco Lovers website is the top EDL on Google, which was, yeah, really quite funny. But it also kind of ended up being this, you know, any Google bomb is a kind of strange engagement, because I suppose in a lot of ways you can sort of look to Google as this font of all knowledge, this arbiter of what is most relevant to a term, and it was quite interesting to push against their sort of algorithm and in a way change what EDL meant in one way or another. But I also mentioned counter protests, so I would organise these protests in collaboration with other people, where people would come dressed in sort of disco gear, sing songs, play music, sing "Glory Again as I Will Survive" to the English Defence League. There's a little kind of slogan on the guy's chest which says "Fewer xenophobes, more strobes." And the project also involved organising these nights. So I don't know how many nights I've put on under the name English Disco Lovers, maybe 30, maybe 40. They're always in aid of anti-racism charities or LGBTQI+ charities, or anti-hate crime charities. So we've given quite a bit of money to Tell Mama, which is a charity that deals with anti-Muslim hate crime. They do a lot of really, really important work. So we just wanted the nights to fund things that were just the antithesis of what the English Defence League was about. And off the back of this, people who've been involved with localised English disco lovers groups, they've continued to run nights themselves, or in the case of the group in Brighton, they actually set up a refugee charity called the Hummingbird Project. So the Brighton arm of English Disco Lovers sort of morphed into a refugee charity and has the English Disco Lovers sort of strand of nights that now support that. When Leah and I were kind of talking about this talk, I promised that I would try and talk a little bit about aspects of, I suppose, the commons. And this is a bit of a reach, I suppose, but I'm just going to say a little bit about authorship with regard to something like English Disco Lovers. Like, I'm not the sole author of it. In the arts, a lot of the time people do kind of operate as or act as they are the sole authors of things that they do. And I think it's quite important to acknowledge that hundreds of people perhaps were very closely involved in making English Disco Lovers what it was. Thousands of people were involved in a kind of smaller way. And whilst I was kind of at the centre of conceptualising it, what it did materially in the world was down to way more people. A guy called Muzz Khan in particular, a guy called Sam Moffat in particular, and a woman called Elaine Ortiz in particular. And the idea for it came totally by accident from my friend Gerard Fife and my friend Emily Collins. We were joking around in a field in Dorset on a camping holiday. So ideas don't emerge from nowhere. They are products of many people who input ideas in different ways. So whilst that isn't really about the commons, it is about problematizing the idea of authorship and how the artist as a sole author is almost kind of raised up far more, because it's maybe a simpler story or a more kind of favourable story under the kind of conditions that we live under. The project, the kind of next big project that I did after English Disco Lovers, it's about this guy, a guy called Michael Ashcroft. So a lot of my work, there tends to be an antagonist, someone that I maybe set myself up in opposition to. And after doing English Disco Lovers for about 3 years, so started it as a second year fine art student, did it for the second year and third year, and then the first year out. And that first year out, I was largely just working as a gallery invigilator, but also working in pubs, and I was living with my grandparents. So it was kind of a weird time where I was going, oh, how do I make art? How do I come off the back of doing this project that had, you know, a lot of attention from a lot of people, and worked well as an artwork, but also as a this multifaceted thing? How do I do something else, and does it have to be better than that? So I kind of grappled with these questions, and this is sort of the project that I ended up doing, and I think it also tries to address, I guess, some of the things that I think about with regard to English disco lovers are, how can I sort of start to address some of Britain's colonial history, for instance, which is a contributing factor to something like the English Defence League existing? How can I, in my work, start talking about wealth inequality, which again is something that contributes to the English Defence League existing? So I'm, in a way, sort of responding to English disco lovers with this project. It's an imperfect response, but it's a response nonetheless. So this guy here on the screen is Michael Ashcroft. He's a former member of the House of Lords. He was Tory party chairman for a while. He's a multi-billionaire. He's also a big-time tax avoider who hides a lot of his money in Belize. So tax avoidance essentially means that high net worth individuals and organisations put their money in places that do not tax them. There are often conditions to this. You know, you might have to live there for a certain amount of time, but they're exploiting these tax loopholes that are only really available to the super rich. He's one of these people. His tax haven of choice is Belize, which is a former British colony. A lot of tax havens are former colonies. They also tend to be island nations. The other interesting thing about Ashcroft is he managed a rhythm and blues band called Trident in the 1960s. This isn't Trident. The weird thing is he only managed them for a few months, and he wanted them to become the equivalent of fame and wealth to the Beatles. He says as much in the first edition of his autobiography. But there's a bit of a vacuum where Trident could have been. I've spoken to a guy called Alistair Primrose, who is an original member of the band, but he wouldn't talk to me really because Ashcroft paid him 10 grand not to speak to journalists and not to release an unofficial biography. So didn't get much from Alistair other than, yes, I was in the band. So yeah, like I say, it left me with a bit of a vacuum to fill, and I started to think, okay, so what if I use this band as a vehicle to talk about tax avoidance and Britain's colonial history, and how do these things start to link up? So this is again another sort of research diagram, and I'll talk through that in a sec. So if we start with the band, Trident, 1960s rhythm and blues band, it's kind of bottom left. What I start to think about is, okay, so what's a trident? Trident is a weapon, a symbol. It's wielded by Poseidon and Neptune in classical mythology. Britannia also has a trident, the female personification of Great Britain. And she gets actually given her trident in a sort of symbolic manner around the time that the British Empire is getting a little shaky. So the gifting of this trident to Britannia is sort of about granting her this mythical right to rule over the seas. And I'll say a little bit more about that in another project, which is towards the end of this talk. But yeah, so I'm linking these things up. Britannia, the British Empire, British colonies, Belize, which I've already mentioned, former British colony where Ashcroft avoids tax. I've got a phrase right in the middle called, which is asset stripping. So asset stripping is a financial practice, which is how Ashcroft made his first million. You would buy companies very, very cheap. Like you'd buy a company for £1 a failing company, and he would sell off anything that he could make money from. He would get money out of pension schemes and that kind of thing, and then he'd let it go bankrupt, or he'd sell it on and walk away with a big wad of cash. And the reason that I'm linking that up with Ashcroft and also the British Empire is because the British Empire operated in a very, very similar way. Colonize a place, extract resources, extract human labour, kind of gut a place of as much value as possible. And if we go up to Belize, I've already spoken about the tax avoidance. But the motto of Belize is in Latin, sub umbra floreo. The English translation is under the shade I flourish. Sub umbra floreo, the literal meaning and the kind of origin of that is, it is more profitable to make your slaves work in the shade than it is to make them work in the sun. So I wanted to take that phrase, under the shade I flourish, and I actually made that the title of this project, because it also reflects how tax avoidance is this kind of opaque thing. You're operating in the dark, and tax avoidance is also this kind of contemporary form of financial colonization. It is not the literal occupation of land by armies and force, but it is a form of power that is exerted in a different way. And then just to kind of complete the diagram, if we loop around from sub umbra floreo, there are the words slave labour, then African musical traditions, then the blues, and then back to Trident, a 1960s rhythm and blues band, with a little note down the bottom about the Beatles, the Stones, and them being British invasion bands, which again is a very colonial phrase. The Beatles were described by Rolling Stone at the time, when they kind of broke America, as taking back British colonies, which I think is very kind of interesting. And I'm also going to say a little bit about the blues. So part of the idea of the commons is the cultural commons, and African musical traditions which influence the blues. The blues is very much a musical genre of the commons. It's folk songs, it's work songs, it is songs that are maybe written by one person, maybe written by many, and they get passed around, and the same songs get sung by many, many different people. And what you get with groups like the Beatles and the Stones, though, is the appropriation of a predominantly Black cultural musical commons. You have an appropriation of it by groups like the Beatles, who, and again I'm quoting from Rolling Stone, sing Black music with funny voices. They weren't writing the majority of their material at the very beginning. Yes, they did. They went on to create some really brilliant stuff. But I do think it is really important to acknowledge that that sound was appropriated, and it was a privatization of a cultural musical commons. So this project is actually a bit overwhelming to talk about, to be honest. And there are loads of strands to it. There's a half-hour documentary, a 10,000 word fan blog, there's a radio show, there's a 10-track rhythm and blues album. But all of this stuff merges together aspects of that diagram, aspects to do with tax avoidance and colonialism, and offers these kind of strange veiled critiques of it. But what I'm just going to show you here are installation shots from an exhibition, which include a map that shows the band going on tour in Central America and the Caribbean. It's also got a large photo of the band and 3 posters that advertise gigs that the band did or didn't actually do. And playing in the space in the basement was this documentary, and playing on speakers were the songs. And at the end of this talk, what I'm going to do is drop a link to the documentary and the password in the chat, because it wouldn't really work to show you a clip now, because you know, it kind of works as a whole thing, and you wouldn't really get to hear the music. So that is another project. This is a work from pretty soon after I graduated. I've just shown you 2 projects that each took in the region of 2 to 3 years each, kind of fitting around being a student and working part-time and then working full-time. This is a project that I did in about half a day. So this object is the, again, antagonist of the project. It's called the Camden Bench. It was commissioned by the London Borough of Camden, and it is designed to not be for things. It is not for rough sleeping. It is not for skateboarding. It is not for hiding drugs underneath. It is not for graffiti. And I was so interested in this object whose function was led by what it is not for, because if it wasn't there, none of those things could happen either, that I decided that I would come up with a function for the bench. That function ended up being a game. The game itself is called A Shared Interest in the Bounce, and it's an invitation for people to play table tennis on the top of the bench. But instead of competing against each other, they try and keep the longest rally possible going. So they work together and kind of compete against the awkward surface of the bench, drawing attention to this object that isn't about solving social issues or ameliorating. It's about deflecting them elsewhere. It's about saying, no, you're an uneconomically productive person. You don't belong here. As a skateboarder, you know, I'm particularly attuned to things like this. Aggressive architecture gets deployed quite a lot to control the body in public space, to determine what is allowed and what is not allowed. Another sort of brief comment with regard to how this work sort of connects to the idea of the commons. When I produced this work, I decided I would make it open source. So the idea is that there are the rules of the game, but if you want to play it, you can adapt those rules, you can add to them, make them better, make them work for you and who you're playing with. So the work is manifested in a bunch of ways. There are these photos and there's a bit of writing that are in publications, but then I've also pasted up the instructions on the benches, and it's also been in exhibitions where replicas of the bench have been made. And in a show a couple of years ago in Norwich, a group of schoolboys in year 7 came every day of the show after school in order to play and in order to develop the game even further and come up with new rules and new ways of playing. Now I'm going to talk about the work in the show. Soon after the 2016 presidential election, Sigourney Weaver appeared on Stephen Colbert's interview show thing. Can't remember what it's called. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. And she talked about how after Trump was elected, she decided to go to Cuba in order to kind of just get away from it a little bit and have a bit of breathing room. And I wasn't actually watching the interview. Someone that I lived with had it on their iPad in the kitchen while I was making breakfast. And Weaver, to Colbert, said something to the effect of, yeah, in Cuba, they've got this enormous art school. They built this art school after the revolution over the Havana golf course. And my ears kind of just pricked up because that just sounded really interesting. And it is true. So Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, after the revolution, they went and they played golf on the Havana golf course. Previously, this had been a whites-only space where people with the skin tone and the heritage of Castro or Che Guevara would have worked, behind the bar. They would not have stepped foot on the golf course. But so they went and they played, and they decided that golf is a bourgeois sport for the elite, so they were going to build an art school over the golf course. And that is exactly what they did. It is not finished. I think 9 buildings were planned, 6 were finished. Could be wrong. But it is a free art school, free to attend. It is a beautiful kind of undulating modernist building. And I really loved that idea of building an art school over the golf course and how that intersected with what Donald Trump sort of was and stood for. Because, Trump had just sort of taken office and soon he will be out of it. But he was spending so much time on golf courses, ordering missile strikes, using his golf courses as meeting places so that he could cream off a bit of extra cash from representatives of foreign governments who would go and pay to stay there or whatever, or he would use US taxpayer money to pay for those expenses. And he was also proposing big cuts to the national funding to the arts in the States at the time. And this is the work that I ended up making. It started off as a poster, kind of in the style of a golf sale, Dayglow poster, and it ended up as this. So I cleaned up what Sigourney Weaver had said, and it was so fitting that she'd said it because she's this amazing science fiction actor that is so tied up in imagining the future. But I tidied up the phrase, made it after the revolution. They built an art school over the golf course with this clean, modernist art school, almost spaceship in the middle. And obviously with these, I'm riffing on Union banners, medieval heraldry, but also the textiles that I saw growing up in Quaker spaces. So in kind of Quaker tradition, people make quilts. There's a lot of quilting that takes place. It goes back hundreds of years, and people would use scraps of clothing and leftover textiles to make quilts. And there are stories about Quaker women gifting bags of quilting materials to women who were being sent to Australia on prison ships. So there's the central banner, and then the two on the left and the right, they actually steal from Donald Trump's coat of arms. So he's got this coat of arms, and it's got. I think he stole it from someone else. So Donald Trump stole his coat of arms from someone else, and he replaced the one word on it, which was integritas, which is Latin for integrity. He replaced it with his own name, Trump. And he's not actually allowed to use it in the UK because we actually have rules to do with who can have heraldry. You can't go around nicking other people's. But I decided I'd nick his, and so this arm comes from it. But I liked the arm because it was holding a spear previously, and I've given it this broken golf club. But it's also quite reminiscent of the of what perhaps we would kind of recognise as the Black Power salute as well. Although that salute and that fist have a longer history, and I think date back to a radical bookshop in Mexico, but I'm a bit hazy on that fact, and I'm trying to do this without my notes. So So this is a work that I made towards the beginning of 2018. I think it was January 5th or January 6th, 2018. It was for the anniversary, the 10-year anniversary of the death of a guy called Aaron Swartz. So Aaron took his own life in January 2008, and he was a campaigner, particularly around internet freedom, and he did a lot of amazing things. Something that he did quite a lot towards the end of his life was doing these large-scale downloads from academic websites like JSTOR, things that are paywalled, so you have to pay money to have access to all of this academic information, which is largely paid for with public money. So Aaron, he was this advocate around freedom to this information that has been paid for with public money, freedom to this kind of intellectual commons, so to speak. And what he'd do with these mass downloads was he would run them through software, and he would analyze the information with this software in order to determine whether, for instance, has this medical organization that sells drugs, have they funded medical research that says their drugs are safe? And he would go looking for these biases that exist throughout this kind of medical research. And he was caught doing one of these mass downloads, and the American kind of secret services decided to make an example of him because he was a very prominent campaigner to do with internet freedoms, and they saw him as a bit of a thorn in their side, in the side of the American government. And they put him through horrendous things that led to him taking his own life. And I wanted to commemorate him and his life in a small way. So this is a publication, and when you open it out, it says, "Aaron Swartz died for you." And inside there are bits of Aaron's writing, bits of writing that I got from friends of his, bits of material from his trial, including the bit of code that he used to do these large downloads. There are photos, there's a manifesto that Aaron wrote called the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto, which I'd highly recommend reading. It's widely available online. But yeah, I thought it was important to remember him that day, because it was at the time that internet neutrality was being debated, which is an idea around, which websites, essentially we have internet neutrality. And if we didn't have that, websites that were bigger or had more money would be able to run or be more accessible, more quickly accessible, and it would contribute again to a shrinking of the internet and a condensing of the internet into the hands of the very rich, like Mark Zuckerberg and so on. But yeah, for me it was very important to remember him, and what was his crime? He took too many books out of the library. Right. How am I for time, Leah?
Yeah, you're okay, Chris. I think we were talking about keeping it to about the hour, so you've got another kind of 10 minutes, and then there is some time for questions if people have any or want to pop them in the chat.
Awesome.
So yeah, you're all good.
Sweet. I'm going to skip this project. I'm just going to talk about it really, really briefly. I was invited to make a billboard artwork for a skate park and art space in Cardiff in 2018. And I'd had this woodcut knocking about on my computer for ages. it shows the 1607 flooding of the Bristol Channel. And I'd also been thinking about climate change and extreme weather and nuclear power. So on the Bristol Channel, historically, there have been many nuclear power stations. They're currently building Hinkley Point C power station. And only a few weeks before I opened the billboard, there were large tremors across Wales that were being caused by most likely fracking. But the work that I ended up creating was a reworking of the 1607 woodcut, putting Hinkley Point C at the centre and trying to think about this sort of set of overlapping issues to do with renewable energy, fossil fuels, nuclear power, but also nuclear waste, the nuclear infrastructure in this country, and how that intersects with the arms trade and that kind of thing. Quite a few things to get into, but I'm just going to leave it at that and move on. This is a font that I made last year. It's called Seasonal Movement Regular, and it's based on the silhouettes of migratory birds. So that includes, I'm actually going to refer to my notes here. So that includes the red knot, the greater flamingo, the hummingbird, the Arctic tern, and the bar-tailed godwit. So I got silhouettes of these birds and kind of on tracing paper traced out all of these letters and numbers and bits of punctuation. And I liked the idea of making glyphs of, Latin glyphs for written language. I like the idea of doing that and basing it on the forms of a migratory species. I thought there was a kind of generative friction there because, the diverse languages that are spoken worldwide today are undeniable products of human migration. Obviously, human migration has also led to the eradication of language too. Many indigenous languages in the United States, for instance, are on the brink of going extinct, and that is due to colonization. But I was thinking about how language has been instrumentalized in the forming of nations and the stoking of nationalism, but is itself a product of people moving around for whatever reason. I'm sure we're all aware that English as a language is a big mix of, French and Nordic dialects. So that's what I was trying to think about with this work. And similarly to the game that I showed earlier, A Shared Interest in the Bounce, which is open source, this font is under something called a Creative Commons license. So when someone makes a thing, a piece of intellectual property, you have the right to basically say, this is mine, I made it, you can't use it unless you give me money to do so. But what I chose to do was to say, no, actually anyone can use this. You can use it for free as long as you're not making money off of it. The only thing that I ask is that you credit me. And if you make something new from it, you have to use the same license as me. You have to use a Creative Commons license that would let anyone else use the thing that you've made. And that's the kind of underlying idea with Creative Commons. It's that things like this font can go out into the world and beget more things, which then beget more, and it's for free, and no one is trying to be all sort of grabby and capitalist about their kind of design work. And obviously that's utopian and doesn't necessarily function under kind of capitalism, but it's also a I suppose, a prototype or a model of how things could be different and how we could imagine our world differently and organise things differently. And I thought it would be very wrong of me to make a font that was about these ideas of migration and then hold on to it and not let it move around, you know? So this is a poster that I made using it, which was for a fundraiser for an artist-led space in South London that I used to work at. So the last piece of work that I'm going to talk about is one of the most recent things that I made. It's a video essay called "What Mortals Henceforth Shall Our Power Adore?" This slide is an etching, and it shows a scene from Homer's The Iliad. It's book number 15. And what's being kind of said, so it's Poseidon speaking, and he says, "Three brethren are we, and sons of Kronos, whom Rhea bare. Zeus and myself, and Hades is the third, the ruler of the folk in the underworld." And this is happening just after they've overthrown their father. And what they're doing is they're dividing up the realms. Zeus is taking the kind of the heavens, the skies, Hades, the underworld, and Poseidon's taking the oceans. And this is how the video starts. The video is called What Mortals Henceforth Shall Our Power Adore? And it's about the trident as this cypher for colonization or colonial intent. How it's this, this symbol that pops up again and again as a legitimizer for the exertion of power over others. So in classical mythology, it is an object that is wielded by Poseidon and Neptune. Poseidon, I'm sure we all know him as the god of the seas, but Poseidon was also god of colonization. Alexander the Great would make sacrifices to him in order to grant him favor in battle. And Alexander created one of the largest empires of the ancient world. And then I touched on this earlier. Another part of the video talks about this fresco, which shows, so the title is Neptune Resigning to Britannia, His Empire of the Sea. And it literally shows Neptune handing over the trident and a crown to Britannia. And for me, this echoes the idea of the divine right of kings, in that the king or the monarch draws their right to rule directly from God. Obviously, that's not true. That's, you know, a crock of lies. But it's through these sort of mythical strands, this sort of extrapolation of power in reverse, that power justifies itself. It's through symbols, it's through artifice and smoke and mirrors. And we have many modern day tridents. I've also mentioned the trident nuclear weapons when I was talking about the peace campaigner Helen Stephen earlier. And there are tridents that appear as tax havens, not tax havens, but fiduciaries. So a fiduciary is a legal organisation that facilitates tax avoidance. And there's one called the Trident Trust. The video itself is about 18 minutes long, and I'll drop the link to that in the chat afterwards if anyone's interested in watching the full thing. But yeah, the video basically takes this symbol and follows it through all of these different historical and contemporary instances, thinking about how the trident kind of acts as, like I said before, this cipher for colonial intent. That is the end of me and my words. Just a bit of information, you know, website, Instagram. You're welcome to email me. And these are just 2 interviews that I did a couple of years ago that I thought were quite nice. But yeah, I'll hand back over to you, Leah. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, thank you so much. That was so interesting. I wonder, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. Chris, do you want to pop those links into the chat as well?
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen because it's going to be easier for me to navigate around. I'll do those links now.
Yeah, and the talk is being recorded, so if anyone has missed anything, it'll be available on the Catalyst website later on in case you want to go back to it. And yeah, and as I already mentioned, just to check out the website for the other upcoming talks and events as part of Common Garden. So Chris, there's a question about, yeah, Nolik is asking, can you talk more about the process of gathering your research?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I guess I'm just a bit of a, I don't know, a bit of a magpie. I do keep an eye out for things that, I don't know, I think might be interesting. So I'm just typing in the password for something. There we go. So one of the video links doesn't need a password, the other one does. So yeah, I guess I'm a bit of a magpie when it comes to these sorts of things. I will hoard these little sort of snippets of information and ideas, and I don't necessarily put a project together within a short space of time. I'm currently working on 2 projects. One's to do with the British monarchy and the arms trade, and another is to do with, I guess, the history of people trying to control the weather. And both of those projects have been going on for anywhere between 3 and 4 years as I grow the body of research and wait for things to sort of start clicking into place. Sometimes things happen a little faster than that. But I suppose a big part of it is, firstly, a bit of luck, but also waiting to be lucky, being ready to be lucky, sensitivity to luck. And then I suppose once I get beyond that initial stage, it's a case of, finding a few books on the topic, doing a bit of a Wikipedia deep dive, speaking to friends and colleagues about what I'm doing. The project to do with the rhythm and blues band wouldn't have turned out the way it did if I hadn't seen my friend Giles for a cup of coffee and told him about what I was working on, and he then pointed out that Britannia also had a trident and that I should look at that. And he was like, I am not the source of every single idea that I kind of put forth. I'm speaking to other people, I'm reading books, I'm watching documentaries. Although it's worth acknowledging that I'm not doing this stuff constantly. I also go skating and see my friends and do the washing up. But yeah, I guess another big part of the gathering process is the organizing process. How do I take all this stuff as I gather it and arrange it in a way that starts to maybe make sense? And the diagrams that I showed you are really like simplified versions. I would try and show you a more complicated one. There's a big one on my wall just there, but you wouldn't be able to read any of it, and it would just look like a bunch of multicolored squiggles. But yeah, I guess the process is kind of as I've described it, but then there's also, things that just crop up in something that I'm reading, or something that like my partner has said, like, oh, should we watch this thing about gods and myths on Netflix? And through watching that, I kind of come across this idea about how gods are just you know, they're manifestations of a society's pre-existing tendencies and desires. Like the society creates the god in its own image, and that, you know, that comes from this like documentary on Netflix. I'm like, whoa, okay, that really flips around some of the stuff that I'm thinking about. So that is the process. It's not clean, it's not plannable. It can be a slog, but it can also fall into place really quickly.
So do you find you maybe have like lots of ideas kind of brewing away, and then something kind of will spark and you'll kind of continue with it?
Yeah, I think the most frustrating thing about them is when they're not brewing at all. You know, a lot of the time things will just lie totally dormant for 3 months, 4 months, 5. Like, if I'm totally honest, I've barely thought about or barely made any work since March. And that's a combination of lockdown being quite hard on my mental health, but also just to do with the fact that I was a bit burnt out after working pretty solidly for a chunk of time, and simply, yeah, running out of ideas that were formed to the point that they could be, yeah, put out into the world, and had sort of gotten beyond what I like to think of as when a project reaches the stage of no longer being a Wikipedia article or a Wikipedia regurgitation.
Another question. Your ideas are so broad. Love seeing the idea maps. Do you ever feel restricted by condensing these subjects into an exhibition?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I suppose more recently, like, well, firstly, yes. You know, sometimes things are better suited to certain formats. But you know, as an artist, I do really value doing exhibitions and really value making art for exhibitions, and I have found that exhibitions can be actually a really important part of what I do, because maybe if I didn't have to show this stuff to anyone, it would just kind of continually be in the research phase, and the exhibition or the making of the art becomes the point at which I have to go, okay, I need to take this information and put it into a form that is communicating these ideas to other people who aren't familiar with them, and also putting them into a format that is compelling, that is perhaps more than the sum of its parts, that you know, that in the way that artworks do, speaks to all kinds of different stuff, from you know, visual history and I guess the sort of tropes of art in some way. It's not a particularly elegant answer, but so yeah, I guess the long and the short of it is I probably need to be restricted by exhibitions sometimes, otherwise I wouldn't actually get around to showing what I'm doing to other people.
Yeah, and I suppose you are, I mean, things like the bounce game, you know, that's another way of showing stuff, I suppose, that is a little bit less restrictive, where you can show stuff in public space as well. I know that you said that you weren't working too much over the last while, but I know that you were working on Garden Flag Needs, which is a project that I was really invested in, and I just wanted to ask you about that in terms of kind of, I suppose, the context of the pandemic, and maybe like realizing how much kind of we need community. And I think just that's interesting in terms of like the commons and mutual aid. And you also spoke about like the other projects, which also kind of donating to charity English Disco Lovers. And I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that, and the kind of yeah, I suppose like that sort of community or helping each other, or donating to charity through your art, which is quite interesting.
Sure. Well, I suppose Garden Flag needs I think, well, the name was my partner's idea. So she and I, during lockdown, so I had quite a lot of scrap material left over from making banners and making other things. And it was all scraps. It wasn't anything that I could necessarily use to make anything about this. But we started just kind of making stuff using my sewing machine because Em wanted to learn and we both needed something to do. And I guess after making a couple, we were like, oh, these are actually not hideous. And we live in an area of South Manchester where quite a lot of people do use food banks, and we thought to ourselves, okay, we've got a good chunk of material. It's not going to cost us anything to do this. Let's put up a little Instagram page and say to the people that we know, we are making these flags. You can order a design and you can pay us between 15 and £50. We'll make it and send it to you. It's all scrap material, and that money, all of that money, minus postage costs, will go to our local food banks. So we did that between, I think, April and July. We made, I think, about 30 to 35 flags, made £1,000 for our local food banks. So yeah, I guess, well, we were doing it because we obviously recognised that there was need for money to go to food banks. We also recognised that we needed something to do. We needed to, I guess, exercise our sort of privilege in a way, and we also needed to exercise our minds. And then I guess a general sort of statement on charity. I wish charities didn't exist. I wish that people paid the appropriate amount of tax, and the very, very wealthy paid a shed ton of tax, so that wealth wasn't concentrated in the hands of the very, very few. If the likes of Michael Ashcroft or Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg were taxed appropriately, there would be no need for charities, because these, there would be money for children who are hungry, families who are hungry, single individuals, because you don't have to be a child or a family to be deserving of not being hungry. I forget who it was. It might have been Clement Attlee or someone. It was to do with like charity and philanthropy, and he said something along the lines of, like, I can't remember exactly what it was, but the gist of it is, I'm not interested in charity or philanthropy. People who want to help should pay their taxes gladly. So yeah, I guess that's my kind of slightly, I don't know, utopian opinion on that kind of thing. Did Michael Ashcroft ever get in touch about your work on him? Has just popped through. So that's a funny story, that one. So there are a couple of things here. After I'd made the work, I applied to a couple of exhibitions, one with Anglia Ruskin University and one with the Historic Dockyard in Chatham. And neither of them would exhibit work that mentioned Ashcroft directly. He's a funder of Anglia Ruskin, and he is on the board for the Imperial War Museums, which the Historic Dockyard is connected to. And neither space would show this work because it was mentioning him and it was critical of him. And then after that, so Ashcroft, he released a book called Call Me Dave, And that book was, it was the one where he accused the then Prime Minister of putting his genitalia in a pig's mouth. So they got a lot of press for that reason. But it meant that he then got profiled by BBC Radio 4. They do these like short profile pieces on people in the news. And a researcher got in touch with me about that bit of, profiling that they were doing, and asked if I knew anything about the band. So I just sent them the music and said it was real. And they ended up using some of it on this BBC4 profile piece about Michael Ashcroft. And all of the songs, they splice in references to colonialism and tax avoidance. So it's kind of obvious that they aren't actually from the 60s, but that was the point where I got a letter saying something to the effect of it was like a cease and desist, but there's not much you can do about this kind of thing if you're the target, because it falls under some pretty robust satire laws. Yeah, he couldn't actually touch me, and I did check with a couple of lawyers, but yeah, so he I don't know if he was behind it, but it did come from his office.
Cool. Well, I think if everyone's happy and there are no more questions, we might leave it at that. So thank you so much again, Chris, for taking the time and for being part of the show. And as I mentioned, we are hoping to open it next Friday. So for anyone who's based in Northern Ireland, come and see Chris's work in reality. Yeah, so thanks all for coming and have a good evening.
Thanks very much for the invitation. Pleasure to be part of the show and to get to talk about my work. And yeah, thanks for everyone for coming along and listening. It's been a pleasure.